Thank you very much for that introduction and for the invitation to address you here today, which I'm very pleased to do. I don't feel half as distinguished as the speakers that come before and after me, and looking at the things that they're to address, I can see a natural degree of overlap in what we'll be talking about, but hopefully my perspective will be of some interest. I come, of course, from the perspective of the humanities, and some of this may not apply to your research or your circumstances, and also what I'm going to tell you is relatively personal. That is, it's based on my journey through my early career, and it might not all have relevance, of course. Well, I don't imagine there are too many other Coptic papyrologists in the room, but hopefully it will have some relevance. And given that I've had a fair degree of experience in applying for funding and assessing fellowships, hopefully my experience in general is enough to pass on some useful tips. So I'm going to really go through a number of areas that I think are very useful to consider when you're trying to articulate that time after the end of your doctorate and trying to articulate into a research career from there. Talking about track record in your profile, describing your impact and recognition, getting funding, of course, although not excessively on that, mainly in terms of fellowships. Some building of teams and networks, although not reprising too much of what we heard before the break. And what I'm going to call project succession, which is thinking of your next project while you're doing your current one. And as my first bit of personal experience, there's the illustrations in the church, the Red Monastery from Sohag in Upper Egypt on this slide. Okay, so my first rule, rule one really implies that I have a number of rules, really only have one rule, and that's love what you research and research what you love. On the screen here you see the earliest papyrus document that illustrates monasticism in the Greco-Roman world, or there's probably Buddhist monastic communities from earlier than that, but let's talk about Christian monasticism, and this document, which comes from the village of Kuranis in Upper Egypt from the year 324 CE, is the earliest time when anyone uses the word monachos for monk. And this is really what binds all my research together. Work on these original documents. This is the petition of a village farmer who complained he'd been beaten up and was helped by a monk. And he writes to the prefect to complain about this. It's on papyrus, it's an original document, and it documents monasticism. And I could just talk about this all day and all night and into the next week. This is really what you need in a research topic. If you can't go to a party and eventually start with 3 or 4 people, like 40 people around you, and bore them all to tears over talking for about 8 hours, then you should choose another research topic. It should be something that excites you and a question that you want to know the answer to. Don't just pick a topic because it's marketable or trendy if you're not really interested in it. Yeah, of course, research strategically. Don't research something that, for the reasons that I'll come to a bit later on in the talk, isn't a sensible thing at the institution that you're at. Or don't research something you know absolutely nothing about. Get to the end of your PhD and think, you know what, physics is fascinating. You need to be able to excite the reader of a grant application. You need to be able to communicate your enthusiasm through what you write, and it's very difficult to do that if you really hate your research topic. And it really helps with your own motivation, of course. If you want to do something, you actually want to do it. And it helps you market your research. I put market in inverted commas as though it might be like a bad word. It's of course not in this context, but I've found that actually thinking about my research as a pitch actually helped for both explaining it to people and in writing grant applications. So that's my really only rule when it comes to research. So I want to talk about early career research paths. For a start, you increasingly hear PhD candidates today talk about, I want a research-only career. And this is either difficult or relatively impossible today. That is a career where you articulate through a series of fellowships from when you're 25 to when you're 65. For a start, not only is that extremely competitive, but bodies like the ARC have really changed their funding structure, so there isn't really anything between the DECRA, the postdoctoral fellowships, and the future fellowships. And it's an unrealistic expectation in that sense. But obviously a postdoctoral fellowship can be an extremely important first step in any sort of career, and so I'm going to discuss today how you might best prepare yourself for that. But of course, a lot of people, and a lot of you, if you go further in academia, are going to be doing early career research within the context of a lecturing position. And I say with workload allowance for research because there's a number of lecturing positions around this country and the world that are classified as teaching only, and if you want to do research, you do it on your own time and aren't given any workload allowance for it. But so a lecturing position where there is some expectation that you might do research. Okay. So what do you need in terms of preparing yourself either for a postdoctoral fellowship application, something like the ARC DECRAs, or the internal Macquarie University funding scheme, such as the MQRF, or for those first few years when you're lecturing, when you're trying to apply for funding for your projects and build your research proposal? Well, in the first instance, you've got to have a good track record. This is the sine qua non of any research funding application, particularly a fellowship. That is your publications and the grants you've won and what you've done in terms of research to that point in your academic career. It's incredibly important for a fellowship application, largely because so many great fellowship applications come across funding bodies' desks every year that often the only way of separating them is the candidate's track record. So you not only have to have a very good track record, but you need to sell it well. When you look at the application forms and the funding rules for schemes like DECRA or MQRF, you'll see that not only do you have to list your publications and your grants, but you need to write prose describing your track record. And it's crucial to be able to write it well, to foreground what's important, and to sell it well, really. And I should really take away those quotation marks around market and sell in terms like that, because that's exactly what you have to do. So publications is very important. Really, when you go now, you used to be able to walk into postdoc fellowships having published nothing, just a great idea and a couple of good references and get one, but that's certainly no longer the case. Certainly you need to be looking at having 3 to 4 quality outputs to be sort of, that is journal articles or whatever it might be, to get to the starting line. And then a lot of the things that have been coming across my desk over the last couple of years have like 8 to 10 like articles in referee journals by their first year out of their PhD. And granted, a lot of them are science PhDs. And in the humanities, certainly we can't compete with that. And maybe in FBE, your publication structure isn't quite like that as well. But it's important to recognize what you're up against. And I tell my postdocs that they want to have 3 or 4, at least in press or forthcoming, when they're applying for postdoctoral fellowships. Only publish in referee journals, obviously. International journals are better. Choose journals that are harder to get into. The harder to get into, the better. Remember, the ARC has sort of discontinued its journal ranking system, that ABC system, which broke down very rapidly and was abused and parochial. But still, the ARC maintains a list of journals, the ERA list. You should make sure that it's on there. Obviously, don't publish exclusively in journals that are published just in Sydney or in Australia. Don't publish exclusively in local journals. Book chapters are very good, obviously, but put them in significant collections that are refereed with good publishers. If it's a book, always think about the publisher. What else do they publish? Do they publish in your field? Obviously, if it's the monograph, this is even more important. Now, I took off the bit here about how you have to have a monograph, because that really only applies to ancient history and the humanities. But if you're in a field where you have to have a book, a monograph, a sole-authored book to get to the starting line, then obviously you should be thinking very carefully about the publisher of that as well. Don't publish exclusively in conference proceedings. Each field is different in this regard. So in things like computer science, conference proceedings are really the main form of publication, and even unpublished conference proceedings, because the field moves so fast. But in many other fields, conference proceedings are very lowly regarded. And in ancient history, it's sort of halfway between that. But what I would say about conference proceedings is, try not to make, if you have a really good piece of research, try not to make the published conference proceedings the only output for that research. Publish a version of that research or something arising from it in a journal or a book chapter as well. And don't do too many book reviews. Yeah, it's great, you get the book, but they're just disregarded in terms of assessing your track record. They're really something you do so you get a free book and to make you actually read it. Okay, so that's one part of your track record, is obviously your publications. And it's important to be able to list them and have a good list, but also to sell them, and we'll come to that in a second. But the other thing people usually ask for is prizes, of course, and what research funding you've been able to get in the past. So this demonstrates your capacity to attract research funding. So there you will, of course, be listing whatever postgraduate funding you've been able to achieve. Outside of your scholarship, because pretty much most PhD students will get a scholarship, so something else, and PGRF, but also look outside the university, because what you're trying to demonstrate to a lot of funding bodies is that you've got the capacity to attract external research funding, particularly to the university. If you're going for an internal university fellowship, the university ideally desires that you take that cost off their hands by winning an external research fellowship. So it's always good to be able to say, well, I applied to this company or the state library or some other foundation external to the university to get money, which might be to travel, it might be for a short-term fellowship, it might just be $2,000 to $5,000. Most of these will just be like $1,000 to $5,000 or something like that. But not only will that help the research outcome, whether that's your PhD or the project you do for a year after you finish your PhD while you're trying to work up your track record to apply for a fellowship or be competitive for an academic job. So you might win enough money to travel to the international centre of your research, to work with people, or to a much better library, or to somewhere where the centre of your discipline. Not only will it actually tangibly help with the outcome of that research, and probably with the output as well, that is, the outcome being what you achieve and the output being the publication, but it actually demonstrates when you come to write up your postdoctoral fellowship application that you do have the capacity to get external funding, and that can make you a more attractive candidate. And that picture there really doesn't have anything to do with that. It's from the 8th century lintel from the hanging church in Cairo. They're not applying for funding in that picture. Okay, so we've talked about your track record, applying for funding. How do you go about building your profile? This is all working towards describing your track record and what you're able to say in these sections in a fellowship application where you talk in prose about how great you are, which is always difficult. You know, there's a fine balancing act between like talking about how great you are and sounding like you really think you're greater than you are. You obviously have to do that, and it always sounds like, because of my project, humanity is going to colonize Mars and will rule the universe in 3 years' time. And it often sounds quite unbelievable. But if you just write, I'm sort of passing fine, maybe I'm okay, I don't know, can I have some money? People then, and someone else really talks themselves up, then they're usually going to go for the person who talks themselves up. But so you have to develop a way of writing about yourself in a way that doesn't make it sound like you've got a big head and a totally inflated idea of what you do. And I'll talk about some strategies about doing that as we go forward. But first, you've got to get known. You've got to build your profile. You've got to become someone in the field that someone will say, oh yeah, Johnson, I saw him present at that conference last year. So present at the peak domestic and international conferences in your field. Try and do it while you're doing your PhD, of course. And even if you don't have a paper to present, see if you can wangle some funding to just go early in your PhD career and see what it's like. Okay, I wished I'd done this. My first big international conference, there's two in my field. There's the International Association of Coptic Studies Conference and the International Association of Papyrologists Congress, every 4 and 3 years respectively. And I didn't go to those till after I'd submitted my PhD and been awarded. So for the first one, the International Coptic Studies, in fact both of those, in the first 2 years after I submitted my doctorate, I paid my own way there, in international airfare to Europe. And I presented at both of them, and I became known within the field internationally. And that's, if you have, great if you can win some travel funding, and this could be something you apply for a small amount of money for. But I mean, when I say small, I mean $2,500, which isn't small, but it is compared to 100 or 2 million or something like that. I paid my own way there, and it's quite a good investment if you have that money available to do that, because then you get known in the field internationally, and you get known as someone within Australia who's working on this. Give paper to other institutions in Australia or overseas. Attend things like summer schools, like a masterclass in your field, either while you're doing a PhD or just immediately after it. We have quite a few of these in papyrology because it's a very technical discipline. I don't know if they do in your fields, but it's a good idea to get to know your cohort internationally. The people that are at your stage of career. And when I was in Vienna, for the Papyrology Congress in 2001, we had a group of us there who were just about to finish our PhDs or had just submitted. There was about 10 to 12 of us, and we hung out. And at every conference since then, we all get together and go and have a drink. We call ourselves the Vienna Babies because that was our first congress there. And now we all have academic positions at different places all over the world, in Spain and Greece and Germany and England and America and France. And there's sort of a network of us who have stuck together, and we're able to be collaborators and invite each other to each other's university. And if you can form a sort of group like that internationally, it's much easier with email and Skype and Facebook and telepathy these days than it used to be, then that can really help you in that first 5 or so years after your PhD. If I was starting now, I would consider something else that wasn't possible then. That is a really good online presence. So taking advantage of non-traditional methods of propagating research. Now, I'm not talking about publishing in online journals, although that's something that is possible now too, but I'm talking about blogs, work in progress papers online, academia, EDU, contributing to discussion forums. One of the guys who's just finished his PhD, the sort of highest profile young scholar in Coptic studies, who just finished his PhD last year, but everyone knows him, is because he's got this blog that everyone goes to. He puts fantastic work up there, unpublished work, and then he publishes it, and it's sort of like a meeting place for Coptic studies scholars who work on manuscripts to come and talk about those sort of things. I didn't do any of that. I mean, there really weren't those sort of blogs. I suppose there were those sort of blogs, but I was very unsavvy in that regard. But I would consider something like that. Not obviously make that your only way you get your work out there. I'm not going to publish in print journals. I'm just going to put unrefereed stuff on my blog. But it's a way to get known, and I advise you strongly to take advantage of that. We'll come to a couple of caveats a bit later. But that's something that I would do if I was starting over now and I had the time and the skill to do that. Okay, so impact and recognition. This is what you have to sell when you come to write any grant application. What's the impact of your work been? Have you developed a new paradigm in your field? Has your work been picked up and developed somehow? Have you totally changed the face of your discipline on the planet? For many people, a year out from their PhD, they say, no, fool. I mean, I'm just starting my research career. But it's important to actually try and demonstrate in that way. Has your work been cited as important by someone? Seek out and note such mentions, not just citations. How's your work impacted the discipline? Or if you can't do that, if your thesis examiners say your work will have an impact on the discipline, then cite that in your fellowship application, because they're like great people in the field, and for sure they're right. It is very difficult, and you shouldn't stretch it, but it's important to actually try and, you have to make that case for how your research is positioned within the field internationally and how it's actually affecting it. So impact and recognition too. How do you get to the stage where someone can see your work and say, this is paradigm shifting, by God? Don't hide your work away. Publish the right things in the right places. Think, is the outlet the right place for the output? Don't hide great work away in a conference proceedings volume that no one will see. Or spend ages working on something that just gets published in some online Estonian journal that no one will rate or even know about. There's this particular journal online in Estonia that lots of ancient history people seem to publish. And it just seems to me that you can send them anything and they'll whack it up. And a lot of people are doing this. Oh, they've got a really fast turnaround. But, I mean, it just seems to be worthless as far as I'm concerned. I don't know why they're wasting their time with that. Because whenever I see that, I think, okay, well, setting that aside, what have you actually done that wasn't just sending something to an online journal that isn't even refereed? Now, online publication's the way of the future, right? And the ARC and other funding bodies are trying to get their heads around how they're actually going to assess this as regard print publication. And certainly by the time we're all finished our careers, this will be the norm. You can already see publishers like scratching their heads as to how they're going to make print journals profitable, and what they've done, of course, is charge libraries $1 billion a second for access to electronic journals. So that too will pass, I think. But online publication has some great advantages. Of course, it's Googleable. And if it's open access, people can find it easily. This can be a great thing, of course, because what all students do when doing an assignment is Google something. And what a lot of academics do first is Google it as well, whatever I'm researching on. And up it comes, and things like JSTOR are all indexed within that, of course. But it can be a bad thing if you publish something that you regret that's eternally Googleable. Particularly if it's sometime in your PhD and you had no real idea and you try and withdraw from that for the next 30 years or so. Oh, no, that was a different Malcolm Choat. It could live with you forever, so you have to be careful, of course. Or the journal could go out of business. The URL could go offline, it could sync without a trace. Research them, ask around. If you're publishing a book, try and strike a balance between a high-ranked publisher and getting it out before your first postdoc finishes. Okay, so yeah, like Cambridge University Press and Oxford University Press are great, but you're old and grey before you even see the proofs, as prestigious as it is. So think about the second-ranked publishers, prestigious American and European presses that are a little bit shorter and a little bit less expensive. We've seen how much like OUP books cost. If you're not in a discipline where citation counts are recorded, and I don't know what it's like for FBE, in the sciences it's automatically all recorded. I've got 19 citations of this article. In ancient history it isn't, and we have to do like self-citation counting. People always say, how many citations you got? Well, I know of 40, but there might be others out there. But just try and keep a record, in any case, of every mention of your work that you come across. Every time someone says something about your work, print it out or write it down. Because this is one of the strategies for writing about your impact. It's much easier to use other people's words to write about yourself than your own. You've immediately externalized that. No, it's not just me that says it's great. Professor X says it. Well, not Professor X, but Professor, some real name. Professor X, that would be very cool, but let's move on. That professor says that my work's excellent. And this is the same strategy that you would apply for writing about yourself for a job application or a promotion application. Insofar as possible, always have other people's words. So this can be a book review or someone discussing your article in a footnote to theirs, or something your thesis examiner said, or an unsolicited email from a legend in the field, whatever it might be. And then you too can be asked to work on this fascinating Coptic magical papyrus, which again doesn't really illustrate anything about what the slide is about, but is so very interesting that it's all, I better move on before I just start talking about that. So, recognition. Okay, so you haven't published a book yet, so it doesn't have any reviews. You've only just published your first 2 articles and they're in press, so you don't have any citations or anyone writing about you. You've got your thesis examiner's comments. How else do you demonstrate your recognition? Talk about invitations you've received. Have you been invited to present at a major conference? Have you been invited by some scholar at another university to come and present in their institutions? Have you been invited to contribute to an edited volume with lots of experts in the field internationally? Have you been invited to act as a referee for a journal or to appear in media? Have you been invited to do anything where your expertise or your research is being called on to put in the public domain? If so, that's the sort of thing that you can put in that fellowship application where it asks you to talk about what you've done in your research career to that point and what impact it's had. Keep a folder on your computer and keep one in your filing cabinet or in a shoebox or just scattered on the floor, however you do it. But keep a note of all of those things so that when the time comes, you're not frantically thinking, well, I did that thing 2 years ago. Because this will help you build up that prose section of a fellowship or a grant application where you describe this, where you develop your narrative. Every application asks you to talk about your skills and your research experience, what led you to this point, and how that skill, experience, and research, previous research outcome enables you to do this project. Now, I must say I didn't do what I'm going to describe next, so it's a cautionary tale of what would have been a better approach than frantically thinking about it and trying to remember what I did over the previous 5 years. But you want to keep that narrative in mind, your own personal research narrative, and you want to keep it current. You want to write down little notes, draft sections. Think about it progressively. Now, of course, after you've done one fellowship application, you're going to have a draft that you can work with. But it's worthwhile excising that from some application and sort of updating it, like a CV, except fleshing out little bits of it, writing a bit of prose about what you've done. Then you won't have to draft it from scratch for each application. It'll sound more realistic, not just something you threw together for the application, and maybe not something that was for an entirely different sort of grant scheme that you've just dropped in this one. So, I'm going to reprise a bit of the information we had in the previous lecture by giving my perspective on building networks in the context of how important that can be for postdoctoral applications or early career research grant applications. So for a start, of course, you have the network of your supervisor and people at your own institution. And so you want to expand beyond that, of course. And many of you will, over the course of your doctorates, go to conferences and meet people. But once your PhD has been examined, if your examiners agree not to be anonymous, to let you know who they are, and they're willing to be approached, then use your PhD examiners, if they have favourable opinions of your thesis, obviously. And they all will of yours. And they did of mine too, except for one guy who suggested I change quite a bit of it. But he was one of the people that really became an academic patron. Him and another guy, and the other guy passed away, so I'm sure he was a patron for a few years before he passed on. But they invited me to conference panels, they invited me to contribute chapters for books. When it came time for their Festschrift, the studies in honour of them, I was invited to do that. They sort of acted like international academic patrons, and the two of them really helped me a lot, and they directly knew about that because of examining my PhD and me writing to them afterwards and saying, oh, thanks, Professors X and Y. How would you suggest that I go about publishing this and articulating the early stage of my academic career? Although, of course, I didn't use those exact words. What should I do now? I more said, ask for further advice, ask to visit their institution and give a paper, or hope that they ask you to do that if you don't want to be so pushy. Then use post-PhD casual employment to your best advantage. So if you want to stay in the academic system, it's relatively rare to finish your PhD and just get offered an academic position, lecturing academic position, or a postdoc right then and there. Some people articulate straight into that, and that's great. A lot of people, and I certainly had to do this, have to kick around for about 3 or so years with various levels of casual employment, be that sessional lecturing or research assistant work. So try and use that to your best advantage. Use post-PhD casual employment to build networks, acquire further academic patrons and mentors, and learn new skills. When I finished, I worked for a professor at Sydney University, that is in the Department of Religion, for 3 years, doing casual tutoring and as his research assistant. And he taught me about Coptic papyrology, which I sort of taught myself during my PhD, but I needed further tutoring in. He co-published with me, he helped me develop as a lecturer, and out of that gave me 3 years talking with him and plugging into his much wider academic network to think about how I was going to frame my first postdoc application. Well, no, because I was trying to apply the whole time for my first postdoc, but frame the one that actually got up in the end. which I'm sort of going to talk about now. So this project that you apply for an ARC DECRA or an MQRF, Macquarie Fellowship, or one of the other university fellowships. It has to be two things. It has to be close enough to your PhD so that it can be demonstrated that you have the skills to do the project. It can't be in something completely different, otherwise they'll say, well, why is this guy doing this project? You have to have the skills, experience, and track record to be able to be a credible candidate for that project. But it has to be different enough so that you're not just doing your PhD again. Otherwise, say, well, we've given you 3 years of funding for that. We're not going to give you another one to just do it better. Although, of course, a lot of people, that's exactly what they do. And if you can get a fellowship to turn your PhD into a book, if you're in that sort of discipline, or 5 articles, then that's great. But my PhD was on the Christian laity, lay Christians, in the papyri in late antique Egypt. And monasticism and Coptic featured quite heavily in that. The Coptic language, documents in Coptic, which is the Egyptian language written in Greek letters, the final stage of the Egyptian language after they got bored with hieroglyphs, decided to use an alphabet, and monasticism, Christian monasticism, which first appeared in Egypt in the 3rd and 4th century CE. And so my MQRF project and my first ARC project took that idea and then focused on monasticism and Coptic in the papyri. So it developed out of my PhD project, but it was a different facet of that. And a good rule of thumb is that a footnote in your PhD can make a great postdoctoral project. Now, you always have footnotes like, this is far too massive a question to get into here, but isn't X or Y fascinating? And that can often grow into a project by itself. Because then that's something that's in your field, usually, but it's something that was tangential. And so there you have an early Coptic papyrus that documents monasticism, and the long destroyed basilica of Pachomius, the founder of communal monasticism in Upper Egypt, which obviously looked better about 1600 years ago, and doesn't even look that good now. That photo's from the 70s, not taken by me, obviously. Okay, second part of networks, sponsor fit. This is super important for applying for university level fellowships at Macquarie or Sydney or anywhere where you have to have a sponsor, where an academic member of staff has to put you forward. This is certainly the case in the MQRF. The sponsor should not only have the experience to guide your research, but have close research alignment. Now, often there are myriadic ways in which you can't actually get the sponsor that you want for a fellowship application. Someone's really good who's right in your line, but he or she already has a candidate they're going to sponsor, or they're going to retire, or they already have too many people they're supervising, or whatever. But in general, once you know what you want to work on, you should be seeking out the person within that institution who has the closest research alignment and asking if they can sponsor you for a fellowship application. So do it as soon as you can, obviously, because really good scholars will get a number of approaches for this sort of thing. And many departments will look at all the applications and sort of say, well, this one should go with this and this one should go with that. But get yourself in the frame at least. Because if you see a fellowship application and you're assessing it, and man, has my tie been back to front the whole time? How professional. And the sponsor has the responsor's research has no relationship to the research of the candidate. You think, well, how are they going to form a team or an academic network? What's the professor going to contribute to that except saying, excellent, well, that's your bit in the lab, or your officer's over here. Come back in 3 years' time. The good fellowship applications are ones in which the sponsor and the fellow, the research fellow, the postdoc, are going to work together. Maybe they'll publish together, or maybe they'll be working on the same sort of thing and really bring a little, build research capacity in that area at the institution. So sponsor fit's very important. Okay, so you got to the stage then when you're actually applying for a fellowship. You're putting in an application for an ARC DECRA or an MQRF. First, the project itself. We've talked about it not being too close to your PhD, but close enough so that you've got the skills to pay the bills. It wants to be ambitious. Can't just be something you could do in 2.5 weeks on the back of an envelope. but it can't be too large. I'm going to completely redefine everything in my field. That's the comment you most see from referees of fellowship applications. The thing's awfully large. I don't know if Johnson could possibly do this in 3 years. It would take me 200 years, assuming someone could live 200 years. But try and strike that balance. Make sure the research is aligned with the institutional research strengths. What are the research strengths of your faculty and your department and your institution? Are you pitching within them? Because you're going to have to write some narrative about how your research relates to research strategy at your institution. And that's going to be a lot easier if someone is actually researching in that area at your institution, obviously. Read the funding rules. Just read the funding rules as the first thing you do. Lots of people say, oh yeah, whatever, no, it's a fellowship, I can do that. And then they write an application which totally disobeys a number of edicts in the funding rules and is ruled ineligible. And that's obviously really annoying after you spend a couple of months on something. It's also really annoying for a fellowship reader. So take note not only of all the little technical things, font size, and margin size, and line spacing, and word limit, and page limit. There can be no excuse for getting those things wrong. But also, what the application form is asking you to write, and what the readers or the panel are assessing against. That is, they will say, like, track record is worth 40%, and the panel are reading against these selection criteria. You know, that you display outstanding achievement in the field of excellence, or whatever it might be. Don't robotically make your fellowship application map onto those selection criteria. Don't just use those as the questions you answer, but make sure all that information can be found in your application in the right place. Don't put all your stuff about how significant your project is in the approach section, or put like 7 pages of detailed methodology in your significance and innovation section. Read the funding rules. And try and find out the sort of scheme that you're applying for. Now I wonder if, yeah, okay. This is what I come to on this slide. Fellowship Applications Part 2. Think about the sort of scheme that you're applying for. Now, the ARC DECRAs and the MQRFs, and under MQRF think about the Sydney and New South Wales fellowship schemes as well. They're very different, they're very similar sorts of schemes in one sense, because they offer 3-year postdoctoral fellowships at level A6 or whatever, and you can get to do your own research. For 3 years, there will never be a better time of your academic life than those 3 years, I can tell you that much right now. See why research-only careers are so enticing. But they're very different sorts of schemes in the way they're assessed. So the ARC has more discipline-specific panels. Okay, so it's not a panel entirely of people in your subdiscipline, but it's a panel of people that are in your general discipline. Okay, whereas the MQRF has a cross-disciplinary panel where 4 people from each faculty all get together and read all the applications. So you have to write in quite a different way. It's a good idea anyway to get someone outside your field to read any grant application, as it is for any publication, but particularly for grant applications. Because even if it's in the ARC and you've got a broad discipline panel, there may not be someone who's in your exact area on the panel. So to a certain extent, you always have to pitch outside your specific discipline area when you're applying for fellowships, and even more so in university level schemes like the MQRF, where you can be guaranteed that there might be no one in your specific area and only like a few people out of a big panel from your faculty who will read this. So you have to, if you're writing for one of those sort of schemes, you have to not use so much technical jargon. You have to explain a little bit more. Doesn't mean that you don't be detailed in your methodology or approach section. It just means not to pack it full of detailed discipline-specific jargon that no one on the panel or only 3 or 2 people will really understand. That means they won't be able to understand your application and they'll mark it lowly just because they can't understand it. But then the ARC, you've got much more and other like sort of government level funding bodies like the American schemes or the European Research Council. You have much freer reign to be more discipline specific in your language, but still you have to think about its readability outside your field. And it has to read well just as prose. Has to pass the first page test where like a reader actually wants to turn the first page of it. So for that reason, it's always a good idea to get it read firstly by someone like an expert, then by someone in your discipline who's not an expert in your subfield, then by someone totally outside the discipline. Do they understand what you're on about? That's really crucial. And don't just go talking about this magical papyrus without really describing what it is. Okay. So what you want to do then, I'm assuming now that you've all articulated into either an academic lecturing appointment where you're doing research within that, or a postdoctoral research position, either a fellowship or some other funded postdoc position, like a full-time research officer position or something like that, in which you've got scope to do your own research as well. What you want to do is be always thinking one project ahead. Now, a lot of people sort of think one project behind. That is, they're applying for money to finish off the project that they didn't get done when they had their last funding application, successful funding application, and they're always running one behind. But you should sort of be thinking one project ahead in terms of how is this research going to articulate into my next project. Think about how the outcomes of your postdoc project will lead to the next one, and design your next project with that in mind, keeping in mind everything that we started with about track record showing your capability to do something. So these things, by this stage, while you could be applying for another fellowship, you're more likely to be applying for actual project funding. And I'll try not to say too much about this because you'll hear more of this later on, and particularly strategies for applying for this sort of funding. But I just want to tell my story, if you like, as a way of illustrating some of these things. When I was doing my fellowship, we appointed a senior lecturer in the field of Coptic studies at Macquarie, an internationally recognised scholar. And I formed sort of like a mini team with her, a research network with her, associated with her. I plugged into her academic and international networks. And then we designed a project which interfaced with research that the Egyptologists were doing at Macquarie, our colleagues. Now, for those of you that aren't specialists in the field of ancient history or Egyptology, if you call yourself an Egyptologist, that means you work on dynastic Egypt, before the conquest of Egypt by Alexander the Great in 332. Pyramids and pharaohs and Ramses, let my people go, and the Colossi at Memnon and all that stuff. It's not half as interesting as they imagine. What's much more interesting is late period Egypt, where you have Greeks and Rome and then the Arab conquest and this trine, quadrilingual and multi-religious situation in Egypt, and all this documentation on papyrus. And it's fascinating, more fascinating than the Egyptologists could dare to dream, because if they dreamt about it, they'd realize it was more fascinating and stop working on their like tombs and come and work with us, where all the tombs had become monastic cells. But we don't get to call ourselves Egyptologists, which is fine, because I don't want to. I'm a papyrologist or a copticist. But we looked across at what they were doing, and they were working on excavating tombs and temples. And in late antiquity, that is the 4th to the 8th century CE, virtually all those ancient tombs and temples from the New Kingdom and the Old Kingdom had become monasteries or monastic cells. So with me and Heike Belmer, we were able to help them track the change in sacred space over 2,500 years, or 4,000 years in some time. Start by associating with a senior colleague at your own institution or elsewhere in Australia. Think about applying for funding with them as part of a team. look for an international partner investigator, and your senior colleague, research colleague, will help you find one of those, but you probably know some already because of building your profile overseas, and plug into current research at your institution. And at least that was what worked for me. And I don't think it's a bad idea in terms of articulating from the first few years of your academic career into a more durable research program. So you want to build a team. Seek colleagues in the department with aligned research. So I did that with Heike Bellmer, who in 2008 was appointed to the chair of Egyptology and Coptology at the University of Göttingen in Germany. And at the same time, my colleague there, Trevor Evans on the right, was appointed at Macquarie. And we use one approach to team building that's worth thinking about. That is not necessarily collaborating on every project, but forming a research program. Now, this is something that, like, you say this to like people in the hard sciences and just say, yeah, of course, because they all have their labs and that's what they do. But in the humanities, it doesn't come naturally. So for people who are, like, in disciplines where it doesn't come naturally, always think of this is one way into building a collaborative enterprise. You have a research program with an overarching title such as Language, Script and Acculturation in Greco-Roman Egypt, and a number of discrete research projects that are all tending towards asking the same questions about this millennium-long period of Egyptian history, fit within that. And you don't necessarily always apply for grants together, but when you do apply for grants, you're able to talk about this area of research coherence at your institution, because you've got a website and you mention each other in your grant applications, and then you're able to invite out visiting experts like Mark de Pauw from the Catholic University of Leuven in this slide, and co-publish with them and build up a little area, a sub-core, if you like, a sub-concentration of research excellence, a SCORE, if I may coin that term. And then after 5 years or so, that can run its term and you can dissolve that and move on to something else, as we now have. But for the first 5 years of Trevor and I's academic careers, and Mark's at about that stage, that really helped us position our research within the university, Australia, and the world. So now I'm going to get a little bit beyond. You're probably thinking, okay, slow down, and I'm still doing my PhD. But if I can just close by sort of speculating on how you might take this sort of 10 to 15 years into your academic career, you want to build a team beyond you and yourself and other tenured or fellowship-holding academics. You want to start by supervising honours students. If you're a research fellow, you'll probably be allowed to do that. You probably are not going to be allowed to be primary supervisor on HDR students if you're a research fellow, but you can probably be an associate supervisor. And so supervise strategically in your research area with projects aligned to your research. Don't just, I know it's great to have like PhD students on your track record which say, oh, I've supervised this one to completion. But it's much more easier when you actually know something at all about their research. So supervise strategically, because the research environment is better when you have students to talk to, or people to talk to you about your research, and there are a few more rewarding things in academia than supervision. Talking to a research candidate about their research, having them tell you things you never thought of before and getting inspired by them, and following that through from start to finish. But also that way you get potential research assistants for projects that they're on. For projects that you win funding for, that they can be research assistants on. So think about, that's the second part of building a team. You've added people at your level and above you, now try and fill in below you with honours and doctoral students. If the opportunity then arises, and again you're not going to do this when you're an MQRF or a DECRA holder, you're not going to be sponsoring other fellowship applications. But when you move beyond that phase and you've got sufficient experience in the field, think about sponsoring an MQRF candidate or recruiting a postdoc applicant via an external scheme. I think I was about 4 years into my position at Macquarie, and I felt that I was sufficient, had enough profile within the university, enough publication, a good enough track record and experience to sponsor a fellowship candidate myself. So I sought out a young scholar overseas who had just finished her PhD and had had a postdoc at Oxford for a year, and invited her, who worked on something very similar to me, and invited her to apply under my sponsorship for an MQRF. And she was successful in that application and started at the start of the year before last. Midway through the year before last. And joined our team and added someone else to our team of people working on Coptic papyrology at Macquarie. So then you have the pieces in place to do the third project, if you like. Topics for this third project should develop organically from previous research and represent a new direction again. And then you can use your team. Don't lose your team, use them. Local CIs at your institution, research students doing part of the project, trained research assistants who you can name in the project, so that they then can become what it would be good for you to do, to hold a research assistant position when you finish your PhD, as a named research associate, if you like, and international partner investigators, international PIs. So while working on papyrus documents for previous projects, using the evidence that was within them to write about monasticism and Christians in Egypt, I found myself fascinated by the process by which they were made. Scribes and scribal practice, not so much the content, but the handwriting on the page. And so I played a bit of a long game. Over a number of years, I co-authored an article which dealt with the theme in 2009 with one of our HDR students, and we took a case study. Although we didn't call it a case study. Never call your article case study, by the way, even if it is one. We co-authored an article which introduced the theme and showed we were interested in it. Then the next year, she presented a paper at the International Peak Body for Papyrology, which outlined the project. Then we workshopped it for a year, talked about it with various people, and then talked about it with Heike and Jenny by email, with the international PI in Göttingen, and with this person that had by now been awarded a fellowship but hadn't come to Macquarie yet. And so before she even applied at Macquarie, we submitted the application in 2011 and got the funding from the ARC to start in 2012. So you have to think about these things a bit ahead. Two final slides that just give you a few tips on how I think you should go about this, and it applies to your PhD as well. Be disciplined and focus on what counts the most, but don't be too disciplined. Don't be one of those robots that said, no, I can't possibly breathe because I'm working at the moment. No, I can't have any friends. I've got to work. But don't take on too much. Don't say yes to everything. Oh, what an honor to be asked to write 7 million words on something I don't really know about. Of course, I'll spend the next 8 years doing that, and you'll publish it somewhere no one will ever read. Don't say yes to everything, but say yes to important things. And don't say no to administrative jobs. If you go have a fellowship or an early career, like an academic job, don't say no to admin jobs that may seem menial but may yield benefit. I just say that because of my own experience of being doing a lot of work, chairing and being on marketing committees for the faculty and the university, and being on the fellowships panel for the university. You build skills that are useful in pitching your research. So I was sent off to do a marketing course by the faculty, and that actually helped a lot in selling my own research, I've got to say. Helps you make contacts in other parts of the university. It helps you meet people in other disciplines. So now, because of those committees, I know people in all other faculties that I can talk to about their research and actually get quite inspired by some of the things that people are doing in biological sciences and physics and cognitive science and other areas. It may seem like a bit of a waste of time, but it's actually not, although it can take up an awful lot of time. So don't just say yes to every administrative task, be pretty hard-nosed about it. But when you're asked to do one, think about how it might help you. There's always more than one path in a research career, and you have to find yours. You've got to make long and short-term plans and try and stick to them, but also be adaptable and responsive to the environment and opportunities. And if you do all of those things and work hard at your track record and think about the way you're selling yourself, build your networks, get known, then you'll put yourself in the best position to articulate from your higher degree research into a fellowship or an early career research career, and hopefully all of you are able to do that. Thank you.